So in this presentation, we're going to talk about land and resource conflicts in kind of a very general way, but then through the example of the FARC in Colombia. So we'll get right into it. The first couple of slides here are just to help us think about the way in which land and resources are tied to the legacies of colonialism, as well as to politics, economics, and social relations across Latin America. So this is a quote from the textbook that I alluded to in a previous presentation that I assigned last year, but didn't assign for this class. But it helps us think about the kind of gross inequalities between different groups of people in Latin America. And these are economic inequalities that we're thinking about here. So as this author, Duncan Green, said, the concentration of land in very few hands, which grew as capitalist agriculture expanded, made Latin America the most unequal continent in the world. And so what he's talking about there is something that we've alluded to before. It's the alienation from the land and from resources of indigenous people and of poorer people in Latin America, all of that land being accrued and held by either the wealthy within their own nations or by outside groups like United Fruit Company, for example. So that's one we've already talked about, that we already know something about in terms of how that multinational corporation was able to take advantage of the wealth of the land and of the labor of local people in a way that profited the company but did not profit the people. And so again, these are the kinds of trends, this is what we're talking about when we talk about capitalist agriculture, large-scale agriculture that's run by large corporations. Also, on even kind of smaller scales, this is an example from Guatemala of a coffee planter, and coffee planting has become, it's not quite the agribusiness that we're talking about when we think about United Fruit, but instead there are kind of mid-size plantations in places like Guatemala that plant and harvest coffee beans that then sell those on the international market. And these can sometimes be Ladino people who are able to acquire and build some land. Sometimes they are the descendants of German immigrants who came to Guatemala at the beginning of the 20th century. But again, all of these different plantations are owned by a person or a small group of people, and hundreds of poorer people, whether Mayan people or Ladino people who don't own land, have to work on these plantations. And the attitude of the owners toward the workers is what I want to get at here. So this one, Lauren, mentioned, I can't give them meat and vegetables on top of everything else or I'd go bankrupt. Anyway, those people are not used to it. They don't want it. This is actually an attitude that has been prevalent in northern New Mexico in recent years, unfortunately. When outsiders or people in larger cities look at the heroin epidemics that have plagued smaller towns like Española or Truchas, there's a text from my wife there. But people looking at the culture of Nuevo Mexicanos and saying that their kind of Hispanic culture, their communal culture, that background is what keeps them in conditions of poverty. And I also teach New Mexico history, and I see these parallels between rural New Mexico and Latin America all too often. I love a quote, though, that I once read from Father Casimiro Roca. He died just a couple of years ago. He was the priest at the Santuario de Chimayo. And he said something to the effect, I don't have it right in front of me, something to the effect that people are poor in northern New Mexico because they lack opportunity, they lack jobs, they lack a good education, and they turn to these kinds of things like heroin and other kinds of problems for those reasons. The issue is poverty. The issues are inequality, not culture. Culture is something that obviously plays a role in people's lives, but it also is an excuse all too often for kind of explaining away poverty, saying, well, they're happy that way. They're not used to living any differently. And so as we go through today, I want us to think about those ways in which politics, economics, and larger issues overlap with access to resources and poverty. We're going to think about the case of the FARC. This is one that was very prevalent about a year ago when the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, finally finished a years-long process of hammering out a peace deal with the group known as the FARC, and we'll get into more of the history of that in just a minute. But he finally was able to hammer out a peace deal after a long period of time, but there had been a political promise that there would be a referendum in Colombia. So again, this meant that the people of Colombia would get to vote on that peace deal. They ended up voting it down. Santos still won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts anyway, and was able to use other means going through the Congress of Colombia to get the peace deal enacted after the fact anyway. So some changes were made based on the no result of the referendum, and the peace deal did finally go into effect at the end of, I can't remember if it was December 2016 or January of 2017. But it's been in effect for a while. And so, again, we're going to talk about how that story helps us to understand these issues of poverty and conflict and the issue of land and resources right at the heart of that. We'll also talk about the water wars in Bolivia and Cochabamba in particular, and the new kind of environmental issue of lithium extraction, also in Bolivia, but in the salt flats of Argentina and Chile as well, right, where those three countries come together. These links here, this one goes to a blog post on a little town called Tomochic in rural northwestern Chihuahua, and the other one is to an article on the town of Canudos in Brazil. You can read those if you get the chance, and I would recommend that you do. They're interesting cases from the 1890s that kind of help us think about how modernization and capitalist development looked to people who were who didn't experience that before, how it changed their customs, their ways of using land, and their ways of relating to resources. So those are resources, or I guess I should say sources for you to go and look at to get more information. But I'll talk about that issue of what is called usos y costumbres, uses and customs, versus law and capital, which became the norm. And again, all of these things together, I hope, will help us to understand the issue of inequality and issues of unequal access to land and resources in Latin America. In order to get the background on the conflict between the state in Colombia and the FARC, that's a group known as the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias Colombianas, or the Colombian Revolutionary Armed Forces. So that's what we're meaning when we talk about the FARC, and they were a leftist guerrilla movement. To better understand those conflicts, we need to think about the physical geography of Colombia and its history prior to the 1960s when the FARC formed. So think about some of the questions that I've posed here on the slide, just from what you can see of the geography of Colombia. The kind of main features of this geography are these mountain ranges, the Occidental y Oriental. We'll have the plains of Orinoco, or the Llanos del Orinoco that connect to the Orinoco River. So there are a lot of lower lands. There's rainforest, especially over in this area where a lot of rural territory is in Colombia. The highest peak is here where Colombia butts up against the Caribbean Sea. Also, of course, I'm obviously addicted to the podcast Radio Ambulante, but there's a story called Boom Colapso that talks about a more recent history of people who migrated from kind of these areas along the border with Venezuela, from Colombia to Venezuela to seek better opportunities when Venezuela was undergoing a boom due to high oil prices in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even into the 2000s under Hugo Chavez. But since the bust that has come more recently, and that's a whole other topic that would take um, a different presentation to really get into in Venezuela, people have begun leaving Venezuela for Colombia. And so there's an interesting pattern of migration along that border, people traversing the border to buy what they need and find the resources that they need just to get by and live um, these days. And so um, this is a very intriguing place. Bogota itself, the capital of Colombia, is in the highlands of the Cordillera Oriental, and there's a valley here in between where there was some FARC activity. So again, as we'll see, the FARC kind of gained strongholds in rural areas. The Colombian state was able to maintain a lot of the urban places that were built either on higher plains, in mountains, or near the coast. All right. Thinking about the Civil War of Colombia, or the conflicts that led to that Civil War, a good place to start is with this man, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan. Gaitan was part of the populist strain of politicians in the 1930s and 40s that was not only kind of a trend in Latin America. So we're thinking about people like Juan Perón, like Getulio Vargas in Brazil, like even FDR in the United States. These were politicians who were really able to connect with the people, make promises and claims that many of them often kept, at least to an extent, to support labor, to provide some sort of social welfare for the people. Also remember, this was during the time of the Great Depression and shortly thereafter, during World War II, when those kinds of issues were on the forefront of people's minds. So among the things that Gaitan was trying to promote was the issue of land reform or agrarian reform. And what is meant there, I mean, that's something like what Arbenz was looking to do in Guatemala later in 1952 with the agrarian reform law. It's breaking up large estates that are often owned by foreign interests and redistributing those, or helping local people have access to land, again, by breaking up those larger holdings and giving more people a share in land. The reason this is so important is that land is the economic backbone of many of these countries. One of the legacies of colonialism is that extractive industries like agriculture or mining are the things that tend to be the most prominent economic drivers. At least that was the case in the mid-20th century still throughout Latin America. And so the idea is that if we can give more people access to land and to livelihood through that land, that will raise everyone's economic and social well-being. There was a lot of controversy over some of Gaitan's ideas, however, political conflicts that we won't get into in a lot of detail in Bogota. And long story short, as you can see from the headline of El Tiempo from 1948 in April, Gaitan was assassinated. Bogota, violence broke out in the streets, buildings were burned down in something called El Bogotazo in 1948. And for the next few months, violence continued in Bogota and throughout the country in what was called La Violencia. Nearly 300,000 people were killed in those conflicts. Coming out of all of that, trying to resolve the situation, the conservative political parties and liberal political parties, and this is usually, or not usually, but this was the political elites, people who already had some access to political power in Colombia, came together and made a new constitution that provided for kind of just a rotating structure of power. So for one term, the Conservative Party would hold power. For the next term, the Liberal Party would hold power, and that just kept switching. Excuse me. That kept switching back and forth as a method of trying to end the violence and create a more stable political situation in Colombia. One of the problems, though, is that any smaller parties or opposition parties were completely shut out of the political process, and sometimes violently. This was why guerrilla organizations formed, like the FARC. Also, there was one called the ELN, or the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, National Liberation Army, which was a separate guerrilla group formed in the early 1960s with the idea of using violent methods to gain political power or access to the political system that they had been shut out of. Also, these groups were Marxist. Marxism gained a lot of traction after the Cuban Revolution, especially because in the Cold War climate of the world, if you were trying to oppose the United States and trying to find an alternative to the capitalism that had brought multinational corporations to your country, that alternative seemed to be Marxism. And so the idea behind a lot of Marxist parties was to bring economic and social leveling through things like agrarian reform, land redistribution, giving more people access to the means of production, as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels would have put it in their original kind of Marxist theorizing from the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. So just to give a little kind of super quick crash course in Marxist thinking, I have these images here to help us think about it. But this, again, Marx and Engels, they were responding to a particular moment in which laborers had become essentially cogs in a huge machine. Without rights, without breaks, there was no such thing as an 8-hour workday, for example, in the factories that they observed in the 1860s in Europe. And so they were thinking not just in terms of how do we fix the factories, but how do we create a different economic system than capitalism that would allow for the sharing of the means of production. So not just allowing the person who owns the factory to make all of the profit, but instead all of the people who work there having a stake in the factory and recognizing the reality that without their labor, the production of whatever it was usually textiles during their lifetime, that wouldn't happen without that labor. And so we need to provide more of the profit to the laborers themselves and having a share in all of those things. And again, that's a very quick crash course in kind of what was thinking. This model here shows more of their thinking in terms of the relationship between what they called the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the workers. The bourgeoisie were people who owned the structures of power, who owned the factories, who were in power politically. And again, as it's right here, they own the means of production. Superstructure and hegemony are other issues we don't need to get into right now, but it's this relationship between the elites and the workers that, in Marx and Engels' thinking at least, they believed there would be this revolution of the proletariat that would unseat the bourgeoisie and would create a new Marxist system in which the masses, the workers, owned the means of production and shared the profits of those means of production. The problem with a lot of their theorizing is that they were pretty idealistic. They had some kind of concrete answers to how is this actually going to happen, but it never actually played out that way. So when, for example, the Russian Revolution took place in 1917, when Lenin came to power, it wasn't the way that they had envisioned. There always ended up being these authoritarian power structures in place to govern and to kind of force a Marxist or communist system economically. That was part of the problem in terms of how these systems actually developed. I mean, similarly in Cuba, if we read about the kind of gains that came under Castro, the healthcare system immensely better, education system immensely better than it had been, but kind of bringing economic prosperity to all was something that didn't happen, and freedoms, individual freedoms, were greatly curtailed and limited. So there's this question of how can you have all these things work together? Salvador Allende in Chile was one in the 70s who seemed like he might be able to address that because he had come to power as a Marxist through a democratic election. He wasn't trying to impose an authoritarian structure, but instead was trying to bring about constitutionally a leveling of economic and social relationships between people in Chile. That didn't happen, though, because of the CIA-sponsored coup that took place in 1973 that brought Augusto Pinochet to power and installed his decades-long brutal dictatorship there. So what I'm getting at here is there's a bit of distance between the theory and the reality of how Marxism should work. And in places like Colombia and others in Latin America in the mid to late 20th century, at least in theory, Marxism seemed like an appealing alternative to the huge inequalities and kind of being shunted out of political power, those problems that existed in Latin America. Going back to Colombia and the FARC then, after the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, the FARC was still in the field. The presidents of Colombia in the 1990s and the early 2000s were trying to figure out how do we deal with this ongoing guerrilla war. Also in the 80s, there had been the advent of major drug trafficking in Colombia. I'm sure many of you have watched Narcos on Netflix and have heard of Escobar and all of those issues that were going on in Colombia. Sometimes the FARC was also involved in drug trafficking. That was a way for it to make money, as it was kind of an underground guerrilla organization that the state was trying to stamp out in the 70s and the 80s. Corruption seeped in on all sides. Violence was a problem on all sides. And so that's something, again, this all became a horrible mess. The ideals that the FARC had begun with were not always there. There are still members of that organization who just want political power. Many of them are trying to find a way to transition into that now. But they had to face violence from the state. This image here on the left-hand side shows members of the AUC, or the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia. Although that means the United Self-Defense Groups of Colombia. This was a paramilitary group that was supported by right-wing factions in the Colombian government in the 1990s, and it was supported by funding that came from the United States to Colombia. These were death squads that were trying to violently stamp out the FARC and the ELN. And again, the point was the state ended up ratcheting up violence against its own people in this conflict with the FARC. The state supported these paramilitaries and was trying to hide, as this cartoon shows, the skeletons in the closet, all of the violence that it had perpetrated. In the early 2000s, under President, and here are some members of the FARC. And so, again, as you can see, these are local rural people who are often less well equipped than the paramilitary groups that have been funded by the Colombian state. Many of them still believe that they had a kind of political goal, an ideological goal in mind by taking up arms and fighting. Others just fought because that's what they had learned and that's what they grew up on, and that was a way of life. Here we go. In the early 2000s, Álvaro Uribe was president of Colombia. As president, he ratcheted up the violence against the FARC. His successor, Juan Manuel Santos, tried to take another tack. Rather than just continuing kind of violent counterinsurgency methods against the FARC, he wanted to bring them to the negotiating table, which he did, held talks for years, between 2012 and 2016, usually in Cuba or other neutral sites for both parties, and finally reached an agreement. And here's a group of the FARC who were at those negotiations in 2016. um, finally reached an agreement that would bring an end to the fighting. Uribe, who is still active in the legislature in Colombia, um, very vociferously opposed the peace deal. Um, One of the problems that he had, he's saying it gave too much amnesty to former members of the FARC, and one of the problems from the other side, from the FARC, they're saying, well, the violence has been perpetrated on both sides. You're proposing to give amnesty to the Autodefensas, the AUC, the other paramilitary groups. Why not us? These kinds of challenges plagued the peace process for a long time. When it came down to it, there were some methods put in place to disarm members of the FARC and paramilitary groups. Also, there was the issue of truth and reconciliation, so trying to find justice for people who had been caught in between. And if you listen to the Snap Judgment, the Radio Ambulante podcast for this unit, you'll hear a story from one of those people who was caught in between. Also, there were a lot of people who fled Colombia. Their stories are shared in some of the links that I've embedded throughout this presentation if you look at the slideshow version of it. And many of them had the opportunity to go and try to get redress through the peace process that was taking place as it was still being finalized in mid-2016, meaning that they could go and make a claim and say, and this happened often, that government forces or paramilitary forces actually framed me for a crime that I did not commit. This was unfortunately something that they very prominently did. They would kind of throw a weapon at someone to get their fingerprints on it, and then use that as evidence that they had committed some sort of crime when they in fact had not. This was part of a scandal in 2008 called the false positive scandal that the Uribe government was caught in. So long story short there, these people who have fled Colombia and who have reasons to want to go and make claims on the peace process so that they might be able to get some sort of compensation or recompense for the injustices done to them and their family members, they're hesitant. They're hesitant to do that because by going and self-identifying, then they'll let people know where they live, where they've fled to, and quite often members of these paramilitary groups are still active and they still are chasing some of these people for a variety of reasons. So it's a horrible mess. Things have gotten better, though, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation. Even though the first referendum that was held in the fall of 2016, so this was just before the presidential elections in the United States, it was October 2016, you can see that this says the periphery voted yes, that's the green, and the center voted no. It says it's a paradox that those that feel the war the least are the ones that are continuing it, meaning that the people in the center in these more urban areas are the ones who didn't have to deal with the war on a day-to-day basis. They're the ones who voted against the peace. Another issue that was interesting as well in that vote was there was a hurricane. Hurricane Matthew hit the coast right as the vote was taking place in Colombia last year, and it kept people from turning out to the polls. So thinking about climate change and how that impacts things that we don't even think it would, it had a role, at least in some part, in that referendum in Colombia last year. I won't go there just yet, but as I mentioned, Santos was able to get the peace deal through, make some changes that the opposition had been very vocal about, and the process is in the works right now. Let me go back here. Sorry for doing that to you. If you click on this tweet from Naomi Klein in the slideshow version, it'll take you to a story in The Guardian that talks about the way in which the peace is playing out this year. It's a story from June. The process of disarming the FARC is behind schedule, but it is taking place. Members of the FARC are turning over their weapons to the United Nations, and they are starting to form an actual political party and have a different way of having a voice in Colombia. And one of the things that they're still interested in is land reform. So this brings us back to this issue that I brought up a minute ago, well, maybe quite a few minutes ago, of usos y costumbres, uses and customs. What we're thinking of here is how the advent of capitalism, new legal regimes impacted people who had not been used to those. So I'm taking us a step back in history now. We're thinking about maybe the 1890s when places like Tomochic, a small town in rural northwestern Chihuahua in Mexico, faced the idea that now there were people who came in and had legal deeds to land, had legal deeds to cattle. Cattle ranching was a big activity in that area of the state. And in the past, people had been used to kind of rustling cattle and trading things off. You can see all the text from my wife coming in. They had old practices, their customs, their uses of resources like animals, like land, that they now didn't have access to anymore because they didn't have a deed. They didn't have a legal deed to that land. Other people had come in, even in Chihuahua, it was large cattle estates and that were owned by U.S. companies and by wealthy people down in Mexico City that had the rights now to the scarce water in the area, that had the right to grazing land, and the traditional ways of just letting your cattle graze or whatever it might be, those things were now illegal. And people found that by doing what they had always been doing, they were now breaking the law. That now they needed to pay money to have access to those things. They didn't have money, and so how are they going to get money? The quote here by Maria Aparecida de Lopez, she wrote a book called De Costumbres y Leyes. If you click on the link, it'll take you to the Google Books site for that. But what she's talking about is this process of going from usos y costumbres to law. And I'm sorry, this one's in Spanish, but it was a quick slide I was able to pull in just to help us think about, I think something that we don't often think about is how these things impact people's lives as transitions are made. This is especially the case in rural Latin America, and these are issues that people are still trying to deal with today. So a traditional use, years ago, you would give a seat to elderly people. I mean, that's just a tradition. The custom, it became then, because we did it so often, a custom that you give the best seats or you give a seat to the elderly. Now in other places, it's become a law that you have to give up your seat on the subway or on a bus to people who are disabled or to pregnant women, children, or the elderly. And so what this process here is showing is that sometimes the way that things are done are codified by laws. Sometimes laws come in, though, and displace and unseat the way things had always been done. And that becomes a problem, especially for the poor and the indigenous in places across Latin America. Some of the more recent manifestations of this have been in Bolivia, where in the early 2000s there was a water war. And this is what is the backdrop for the film, Even the Rain. So I hope you get the opportunity to view that. But in the city of Cochabamba, which is a kind of smaller city in Bolivia, in the early 2000s, as part of a debt restructuring agreement with the World Bank and the IMF, water was privatized there. So rather than the water utility being a public utility that was run by the Bolivian government or by local municipal resources, it was instead turned over to a company out of Los Angeles called the Bechtel Corporation. Locally, it was called Aguas de Turari. So that was kind of the local subsidiary of the company that was building new water infrastructure and taking over billing and providing people with access to water. The problem was that the rates for water quadrupled. People could no longer afford access to drinking water. This was something that impacted women, children especially hard, Women were the ones who were, again, trying to maintain their homes. Men were working and they didn't have access to just this basic kind of life-giving element of day-to-day life. So there was a group that came together called La Coordinadora that protested this privatization of the water supply, the water utility in Cochabamba. They blamed the company for, as they put it, trying to lease the rain, saying this is a human right. We all have the right to water. It's just immoral that you have taken this to the extent that you have, and charging us so much for our water supply. One of the leaders of this protest was a guy named Oscar Oliveira. He not only led protests in the streets like the one in this picture, but he spoke in Washington, D.C. And New York in front of the United Nations, trying to make this issue known. Interestingly, there wasn't a lot of news about this. There was a journalist named Jim Schultz who got the word out on the internet. And then a couple of years later, about 2003 or 4, a writer for The New Yorker picked up on this, and it became more common knowledge. It seems that no one actually won here. The Bethel Corporation appealed to the IMF and the World Bank to get their money back out of what they had invested. And the people, although they gained access to the water utility, to controlling the water utility once again, don't have the resources to develop it or to really get water to people. And so there's sort of a haphazard, as we're able to build pipe or as we're able to build some infrastructure, way of getting water to people in Cochabamba that is relatively ineffective. And it's an issue that still needs to be addressed. I wanted to end talking about the advent of lithium mining. So this is something that'll help us think about environment and resources as it relates to our computers and our cell phones. We all have these lithium batteries in all of our technology that we're using today. Even things like electric cars are relying on that. Where does that lithium come from? A lot of the mines have been depleted, and so there is a process of taking continental brine, so this is something that's found in salt flats especially, and extracting lithium from that. The site for that, or as this is put, the lithium triangle in South America, are all of these salt flats in Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina that have transformed local economies. And depending on the place and depending on the salt flat, there are either multinational corporations that are involved in trying to harvest this lithium. There are companies like Tesla who are interested in getting lithium from Bolivia and Argentina and Chile that are thinking in terms of fair trade rather than free trade. That's something you might see on coffee packages or on clothing. Something that's fair trade means that the rights and the pay to the people who are involved in harvesting that resource have actually been taken into account. They've been dealt with fairly. Free trade, on the other hand, and although it sounds pretty good, is that neoliberal way of looking at these things like colonial possessions, things to be extracted, things for us to make a profit off of, unfortunately. So again, these are stories. You can click on some of the pictures and get more details about the ways in which lithium is being extracted. But there are people being caught in between. The laborers are caught in between. And that issue of access to land and resources is still something that's very prominent. It's something we don't always think about as Americans living in cities. Rural people probably think about it to a greater extent than urban folks do. But these are issues that still generate inequality and need resolution across the region.